Hello everyone. Welcome back to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. I am Ben, give me more Karma Holmes, and in this video we're going to be working on our first official full stack application, bringing together the frameworks we've been using in the front-end tracks and the back-end tracks in order to build a fully functional application. In this case, a very rudimentary version of Reddit. So you can see here I have the project description pulled up. First, we're going to check out some of the technologies that we'll be using for this. For the front-end and back-end, this should be familiar to you. Back-end, you'll be using MongoDB in order to get Reddit posts out of a database and throw them onto the screen. And I have the resources for that for you down here. And the front end, you're going to be working on a bit of a state management activity, which has been the bulk of the curriculum, since state management is kind of the core of React.js, as well as lifting state in order to manage UI interaction across multiple components. And again, at the bottom, I have some resources noted for you, just going into our existing curriculum to refresh you on all of the important concepts. And most importantly, at the top here, we will be using Git as well as GitHub. So make sure you have a GitHub account created and you also have Git installed on your computer. If you don't have Git installed or you're forgetting some of the concepts about how Git works on a fundamental level, I recommend checking out the curriculum and going to the Getting Started page. Terrible pun, but makes me laugh. Under the fundamentals page, clicking on this, you'll be able to get some background if you need a refresher on what is Git, what is version control. It provides some nice visuals and charts in order to understand what it means to create a branch and merge that branch and all of the other important aspects of Git. And I have some video takeaways noted at the bottom of these as well if you need a quick TLDR in order to get started. I also recommend checking out this video, which will walk you through all of the buttons inside of VS Code in order to use the most important Git functions. This means you won't have to use the terminal, which can be kind of scary and daunting to beginners. Instead, you'll be able to click a lot of buttons that are the functional equivalent of these commands, which you can see the important timestamps for down here if you need to check out how each of these functions work individually. So heading back to the project description, just a quick run through for people who are following along with our in-person workshops. This will be a pretty tight deadline. You'll have about a week or so in order to work on this project, but it shouldn't take you more than 3 hours to complete beginning to end. And instead of doing our traditional in-person lessons, we will actually be having in-person office hours during our normal workshop times, where you'll be able to follow along and just work independently and ask questions to me or your peers whenever problems come up. And yes, if you are following along in person, you can work with a partner. You will need to take a selfie, either working over video or working in person to sort of show that you were collaborating together in some way. But you're allowed to either work on the same machine and just submit one pull request to me, and we will explain pull requests in a bit. Or you can actually use Git in order to work off of the same branch and push and pull from each other's work, which is a great way to sort of get more comfortable with the Git concepts. Either way is totally valid. Just make sure there's some sort of video or in-person proof that you were working together. And if you're following along online, you can obviously ignore all of the deadlines and selfies and all of that, but you will be able to still follow along by cloning the Reddit project repository and checking out the issue that you'll be working on. So let's just jump right into it here. However you're following along, you can click on this link in order to check out the codebase. This should be publicly available. And you can see right here we have a README with advice on how to install this project locally and get it running. And you'll also need to set up a couple environment variables if you're following along with the backend. You'll need to get that from us, or if you're following along online, you'll be able to create a Atlas database, which you should be somewhat familiar with our online resources, and you'll be connecting to that Atlas database in order to get it working. We'll explain all of that in a moment. So let's just clone this repository to our machine in order to start using it. You can see I can clone with the URL. Make sure to copy it from here instead of just highlighting directly. Both are valid, but this is the shortcut to do it. And I'll go ahead and open my Visual Studio Code editor. And inside of here, I can either use the terminal in order to clone this onto my machine, or I can use a Visual Studio command in order to get it working. So the cleanest way to do that is to open our command palette. You can do that by clicking on View, either on Mac or Windows, and then clicking the Command Palette button, or you can click the keyboard shortcut listed there. So inside of here, we have a little caret symbol, which indicates that we're about to type a command into Visual Studio Code. And if you have Git installed on your machine, this should work correctly. All you have to do is type next to that little caret the word Git, and you'll see a few commands pop up here. You can either open a repository, create a new one, if you're working on an entirely new project and you want to upload to GitHub, or in our case, we're trying to clone a project that exists out in cyberspace. So I'm going to hit git clone, and I'm going to paste in the repository URL that we just copied from GitHub. And then it will open up our file dialog in order to decide where we're going to save this project. In this case, I have a repositories folder that I want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and select this as the location to create that repository. And then you'll see it loads very quickly. There's not a whole lot of code to download. And then we'll be able to open our clone repository inside of our editor right from here. I'm going to hit open, and that should open directly into that folder. You'll notice that that was very easy to do if you're familiar with using the command line in order to git clone a repository. You can do that as well. Tutorials for that are listed under the Getting Started page. But just for the rest of this walkthrough, I'm going to be using the shiny GitHub buttons inside of VS Code just to make your lives a little bit easier. So you can see here, we have the Reddit project cloned to our machine and opened up here. We have both a front end and a back end component. And all of these have a bunch of JavaScript in order to get them working. Back end using Express.js, front end using React, which should follow along with what we've been learning so far. So in order to get this project running, we can check out the README file actually, in order to understand what's going on. You can either open the README right here, which pulls up sort of a plain text version of how that looks. Alternatively, you can click out to Google Chrome and check out the very pretty version that you see listed here on GitHub. So what we need to do, first we need to go into each of the front-end and back-end folders and install dependencies. So all npm install is going to do, if you remember correctly, is check out whatever's inside of our package.json in each of these folders. And these are basically like shopping lists that tell npm, hey, go to the npm store and download these specific packages. In this case, for front-end, we need to install React, the React document manipulation tool, and then some scripts in order to get this project running locally, as well as Axios, which we don't use in this repository very much, but it's just sort of a cleaner way in order to fetch information from the internet, the same way we were using the fetch API back in the joke generator activity. And then the backend is going to have a similar package.json that we need to install. So in order to install these dependencies, I'm going to go ahead and open my terminal by clicking the terminal option inside of the ribbon, and then clicking New Terminal. Again, you can also use the keyboard shortcut listed there. So you can see I'm open inside of our Bootcamp Reddit project already, so I don't have to cd to any specific location. All I have to do is run the commands that were listed inside of the README. I'm going to open that file here and just copy and paste all this stuff, and then paste it inside of here. This should go ahead and go into the front-end folder first, install all the dependencies, and then it should, two dots here, should back out of the front-end folder, and then jump into the back-end directory to install all of those dependencies. So you see the front-end folder is going to take a little bit of time. React has a lot of dependencies, and your mileage may vary on how long this takes. And if you get any warnings, that's okay. There's always going to be vulnerabilities in the packages we install. Every once in a while, you'll see where it's totally clean and there are no vulnerabilities, but that's very rare. And now we should have everything installed correctly. So if we head back to our README, I'm going to go to the pretty version on Chrome. We can go ahead and install and fire up both the front end and back end directories. So I'm going to fire up the front end first since it requires very little effort to do. I'm going to navigate to the front end folder. So I have to back out of my current directory and jump over to front end. And then I'm going to run the command npm start. And that should head over to the script that we have defined in order to start the application. You can go peek inside of package.json to see what that script is, and then it will pull it up inside of our local web browser. And you'll see that is running on localhost, which means that it is running locally on our machine. This website that we have just pulled up is not accessible anywhere else on the internet. It's just accessible locally, just by accessing the port number 3000. So inside of here, we have a very ugly but functional version of Reddit where you're able to create a post with an author title and text. And you're also able to view all of the posts from the past week, month, or year. And this is going to be the bulk of the work that you're going to do for the front-end version of this Reddit project. But you'll see that we don't have any posts loading yet. That's because we do not have the backend running. So in order to run the backend, first we need to set up some environment variables in order to connect to a database to actually pull information out of that database. In this case, it's going to be pulling some Reddit posts out of a database. And then we're going to run that and display all of those posts onto the front end. So in order to do that, first we need to get our environment variables. In order to do this, if you're following along online, you'll need to whip up a database on MongoDB Atlas and then connect to that database from here. And you'll also probably need to set up some dummy data for that, although there is a task in the backend version of this Reddit project in order to create dummy data. But if you're following along with the in-person workshops, I will be able to provide a database with information in it already. Either one is totally fine. I do recommend setting up the database on your own if you're in the backend track and you want to get more familiar with just firing up a database and connecting to it easily. But if you're following along with front end, you obviously don't want to deal with all that hassle. So just ask me for those environment variables. So with the help of movie magic, I'm going to go ahead and copy those environment variables and paste them in. All right, so now we have our environment variables declared and we're ready to rock. So we went ahead and inserted that environment variable into the backend directory. Make sure you put it in here instead of outside of that, inside of the global directory. And all you need to specify inside of here, and this is documented inside of app.js, all you need to specify is the MongoDB underscore URI. And this is something you'll be able to copy and paste out of MongoDB Atlas or the Compass tool. If you're using that, that's kind of like a visual editor for your database, which you should be familiar with if you're working in the backend track. And you'll just need to specify a username and password in order to connect to that database. And make sure you actually include the name of the database inside of your connection string. And once you do that, you'll be able to connect to that database and get all of the posts out of it. You can either use your own database that you're creating yourself, or you can go ahead and use the string that I will supply you. And that will just have one entry in it to get you all started. So now we should be able to start up our front end and our back end in order to see those posts. So I'm going to go ahead and run my front end here again. All I have to do is npm start. You'll see it goes to React scripts. And over here, it'll pop right over to my web browser. And you'll see back to where we were before. You saw there sort of some coming attractions while I was debugging. And now we'll be able to start up our backend server in order to actually show some posts on the page. So in order to do that, you can either hit the add button to create a new terminal inside of here and sort of go between those two. Or what I would recommend is actually pulling up a split terminal, which also is a keyboard shortcut, in order to see our front end and back end running side by side. But you will need to have two different terminals open in order to run the front end and back end processes. So in order to do that, I'm going to back out of this folder and head over to backend. And inside of here, we already have our dependencies installed from when we use the README to set everything up. And now we're just going to start up our backend with the same command we used for our front end. And you'll see everything loads up. You should see successfully connected to MongoDB, assuming your connection string that you specified in your environment file .env right here is correct. And once we head back over to our front end over here, we can refresh the page and we should see those posts pull up from our backend. And you'll see there's a concept of just general posts all throughout the thread, as well as comments on those individual posts. And you'll see that there's an upvote and a downvote counter, a title for the post, the author's username, which is just going to be hard-coded for now. We're not going to be dealing with user authentication for this project. And inside of that, we'll just see the content of their entire post. In this case, just wanted to shout out some of the work that MedShare is doing during this crazy time with the coronavirus. They're actually continuing to donate medical supplies across the country and in third world countries around the world, which is absolutely amazing. And this is just a fake comment from James Wang, our current director of Bits of Good, just sort of complimenting the work that they're doing. But you'll see a lot of this looks like it's fully functional. You can even see that the reply button does work. If I were to say my name was bholmesdev, again, we would be using user authentication instead of manually typing in the author name. But just for simplicity, we're going to type in the author name manually. I'm just going to go ahead and say, that's awesome, just as a little proof of concept here. And when we go ahead and submit that, we'll see the comment pulls up right here at the bottom of our comment thread. And we'll be able to reply to those comments just downward further and further and further. As you know, Reddit threads can go infinitely down. Maybe there's a limit, but I don't know what it is. But one thing that you notice is when we try to go upvote or downvote these, nothing is going to happen. And that's because this is an open issue that we need to actually get working on our Reddit application. And this is going to be the task that you're going to work on if you're in the front end track. You're going to actually get the logic to work for upvoting and downvoting on posts. And you're also going to set up a global upvote and downvote counter to sort of show user engagement with the thread. And we'll get into that in a bit when we actually look at issue details. And for you backend people, you'll notice that one other part of this application doesn't work, which is the ability to filter out posts depending on when they were posted. In this case, what we want to be able to support is viewing posts from the past week, which are going to be these guys, and then viewing from the past month and the past year in order to show a longer and longer list, and then also being able to view posts that are older than a year. So not including anything posted this year, I just want to look at posts that were posted a year ago. And then I want to view posts that were posted a very long time ago, in this case, ancient times. And all that's going to do is look up posts that are 10 years old or older. And again, all of this is detailed inside of a GitHub issue, which we'll be looking at in a moment. But that's a general overview of how this application is working right now. We're able to create posts and create comments. We just need to get some of that engagement working with upvotes and downvotes and some filtering. So heading back over to our code base, I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of both the front end and back end. I'll provide timestamps in the description of this video and on the Notion so that you can jump to the appropriate section, because the front end people only need to know how the React app's working. Back end only really needs to know how the API routes are set up with Express. So jumping into the front end first, we're going to go ahead and open the front end directory. If you're in the front end track, you can go ahead and close this backend folder forever. You don't need to open it or peek into it, as long as everything is working, of course. And we'll see that all of our code exists inside of the source directory, src. And that's traditionally how your application is going to be set up whenever you're working on a full-scale React project. You will have your package, which specifies all the dependencies that your project has, and then you'll have a source folder with all of your code. Inside of this, we have our index.js, which is just what renders our entire React application to the page. In this case, it'll jump over to our HTML file. It'll find an element with an ID of root, and it'll slap our entire app inside of there. Things actually start to get interesting when we look at our app.js. This is our first bit of logic where you'll see there are a lot of API requests that get specified inside of here because we have to have all the logic built out to get all of the posts. We need to get posts by a particular date. This is going to be fully functional once the backend task is completed, which front-end people, you will not be able to see the fruits of this labor unless you want to work on the backend yourself. But backend people will be able to use your front end in order to debug and make sure that everything is functional on your end. And we'll also see logic to create posts and delete posts. These are all accomplished just using fetch request. Again, we'll see the fetch API is coming back. It works exactly the same as it did when we were working on the joke generator the first 4 weeks of this bootcamp. Now we're just doing it inside of a function within a React application. But fetch can be used to post information to a database as well. We can also use fetch to delete entries from a database. We can use fetch to do literally anything. We just use fetch to talk to a backend generally. And you won't have to worry about setting up fetch logic for this specific issue, but it's great to scroll through all of these methods in order to see, okay, how would I post information to a database using fetch? Let's look through some of the logic for that, And we'll see there's also logic to create and delete comments. Editing your comments, which is functionality that's not built out either. You can sort of treat that as a bonus task if you want to figure that out. And then inside of here, the bulk of our application, all it's going to do is it's going to create a couple components in order to add post, the sort by dialog, which is this dropdown right here. This is the sort by component. And then below these, we'll see the logic to take all of the posts that we got from the database and turn those into posts on our page. So basically what we're seeing here, add post, which is going to be this section here, sort by, which is the dropdown. You don't have to worry about that. And then mapping all of our posts that we get from the database, which is just an array of JavaScript objects, or JSON, which you should be familiar with at this point, and mapping each of those to post components. And we'll see this is a post component right here. A post includes all the details about the post and all of the comments for that particular post. And we're actually going to jump into the post component here to see how it works. Remember, you can hold down Command on Mac or the Control key on Windows, and you'll see a little hyperlink pop up. And I'm able to just click on the component in order to pull up that file, in order to view all the information about it. That's why we create one component inside of each file to quickly jump through a code base easily. So inside of here, we have another functional component. We'll see that it gets a lot of props from app.js. In this case, we're passing down an actual identifier that we use from the database. You don't have to worry about this too much. Just know it's like a unique identifier for that post. Everything just has this garbled hash of letters and numbers. And then we have the details of our post itself, which is just our current post inside of our map function. And then we have all of our functionality that will just go to the API and fetch information. We're passing all of these fetch requests, all these functions up here in order to fetch information as props down to the post component. Alternatively, we could have just defined these functions inside of the post component directly, but as a sort of demonstration of how it actually, how you would pass functions as props, I went ahead and passed down all of these functions from app.js. It also helps to sort of centralize all of our logic. And there are a couple functions here that have to do things inside of app.js. Again, with the concept of lifting state, we'll see that app.js manages the list of posts that we actually have. So in order to actually update the page and add a new post to that page, we have to create our functionality for that inside of app.js in order for it to access this post variable in order to add a new post to the page. So as an example of that, let's check out the create post function here. Inside of this, what it does is it takes in all the information about a particular post. It tells the API, hey, I just created a post and I want you to throw this in the database. It does that by passing all the information about that post inside of the body. And then it will get a response back from the database that says, hey, I got your request. I was able to add the post to the database successfully. And just as a reminder, here's the data that I just added. Not super important, but it's helpful to know here as just an acknowledgement from the database that I was able to get all the information about the post and all that information is correct. And once we get that sort of response back, we get the A-OK. We go ahead and actually update the list of posts that we have stored locally. Because if you remember, the way that this is set up right now is post is just a state variable at the top of the file. It's just a dummy list of posts that we initially get from the database when we first pull up the website. But every time a new post gets added, we have to manually go in and add that post to our list of posts that we're displaying on the application. So once we add it to the database, we also have to add it to the list of posts that we are displaying on our website. And that's all it's doing here. It's just getting that response back from the database, and it's slapping that post into our list of posts that we're displaying to the user. This also means that it's able to update in real time, basically. So when you add it, you don't have to refresh the page in order to see that new post. You'll just see that post get added immediately. So as a full run through of how the heck this thing is working, the create post function is first created here. It's able to access the list of posts that's stored in our application, and it's able to add a post to the end of that running list of posts. And we go ahead and pass this create post function down to our add post component. And the add post component is just this big form at the top that lets us submit the author, title, and text of the post that we're trying to create. So again, I can command click or control click in order to access that file and see what the heck's going on. Don't worry too much about this guy, but basically what it's doing is it's able to take in the function, the create post function, as a prop, and it's able to call that function every time we hit the submit button. So we should see that at the bottom here. We have the submit button, and we'll see the submit function here. There's a few pieces of logic in order to check on whether or not the user has specified all of the fields. Basically, if the user doesn't supply an author, it will warn the user that you need to supply an author before I submit. Same with title and text. But the main piece of logic down here that we need to worry about is whenever the submit button is clicked and all the fields look okay, it's going to call the onSubmit function, and it's going to pass all the information about that post. And if we remember, going back to app.js, onSubmit is indeed the prop that we're passing down to add post, and the value of that prop is going to be our create post function. So what it's doing is the add post component is going to take all the information that you typed into this form, and it's going to go ahead and tell the parent, hey, I just created a post, and I want you to add it to your list of posts that you have stored. So it's the function that we created, this create post function, is basically the way that the child is able to talk to the parent and say, hey, mom, go ahead and add this post to this running list of posts that you have defined. So that's kind of the weird way that React is able to work. We're able to pass a function down to another component, and that component is able to call that function in order to update something where that function was initially declared. That's kind of the funky thing about React, is it's able to remember everything about where it was declared. Even though we're passing down create post to the add post component, it's still able to remember this set post function in order to update the running list of posts inside of app.js. If you need a refresher on how lifting state works, you can totally go ahead and click out the curriculum notes for that. But that's just a quick walkthrough of how all of this logic is working. But what you're going to be working on is not anything inside of the add post component. Instead, we're going to be working on the upvote and downvote logic inside of the post component. I mean, we can see all of that declared here, where we have our upvote and downvote buttons that are literally just up arrow and down arrow. We can see that reflected inside of our UI here. These are the up arrow and down arrow buttons. And in between those two, we have our running list of upvotes and downvotes. And this is an important note. The way that it's being stored in the database right now is every post has a number of upvotes and a number of downvotes. In order to get the total votes that a post has, we need to subtract the amount of downvotes a post has from its list of upvotes. This allows us to have a list of how negatively reviewed a post has been, which Reddit often uses to moderate posts. If something gets a certain amount of downvotes, you may need to take it down or notify moderators. But in our case, all we're doing is we're just displaying the difference between upvotes and downvotes. In this case, this post had 1 downvote and 50 upvotes. So sort of taking that subtraction, we get 49 votes total. And clicking on the downvote function, we'll need to reduce that to 48 votes and so on and so forth. And the rest of this is just all of the details of the post. We won't need to deal with these. The main thing that we're going to deal with is first being able to store the amount of upvotes and downvotes something has, and whether or not something has been upvoted or downvoted. Because something that Reddit's able to do is give a little visual indicator whether you've upvoted or you've downvoted something. Like if you click the up arrow, it should turn blue in order to tell you, okay, I just upvoted this post. And if you click the down arrow, it should turn blue as well to say, okay, I just downvoted this post. And this leads to a bit of tricky logic, which I'll explain through the list of GitHub issues that we're going to be resolving. So heading back to our GitHub page, you should still have this pulled up in your browser. If not, go ahead and go to the Notion page in order to find that. And we're going to go ahead and go to the Issues tab in order to see what we're going to be working on for the front end track. So if you're curious about what the backend is doing, you can click on this guy. But if you're in the front end track, all you need to do is go to this issue and look through the entire guide in order to understand what you need to get working. So inside of this, we have the first assignment, which is what I just detailed, making the upvote and down buttons work. So the way that this works is when an upvote is selected, we should take the vote count and add 1 to it. So take upvotes and add 1 to upvotes. If downvote is selected, we need to take the downvotes and add 1 to the downvotes, which is the equivalent of taking the original vote count and subtracting by 1. And whenever we select these, we're basically toggling them on and off. This is not going to be, basically you can click downvote as many times as you want, it'll just keep subtracting 1. This is going to work a little differently from that. So when we see here, the behavior that we're expecting from this guy is right now it's at 49, which is without us clicking either an upvote or a downvote. When I click upvote, I expect this number to go up to 50. And I also expect this arrow to glow blue in order to indicate that I have upvoted this post. Now, if I click the upvote button again, it should not go up to 51. And I shouldn't be able to go like 52, 53, 54. I shouldn't be able to like constantly keep increasing the upvotes because that's not how Reddit works. Every user is able to give 1 upvote to a particular post. And that user is also able to give 1 downvote to a particular post. It can't just upvote infinitely or else posts would just rocket to the top if you tell one friend, hey, go upvote my post 1,000 times so that I become famous. So in order to mirror that logic, you're going to need to find a way to keep track of whether or not the user has clicked on the upvote button. So the behavior that we expect is when I click upvote, the upvote should go up by 1. And if I click it again, the upvote should go back down to their original value. So if I click it once, it goes from 49 to 50. Click it again, we toggle that upvote off, so it goes from 50 back down to 49. Similar case with downvotes. If I click it, it should go down to 48. Click it again, it should go back up to 49. And then there's the really weird edge case where you shouldn't be able to assign both an upvote and a downvote to the same post, because that would be kind of confusing. Like if I both upvoted and downvoted, it would still be at 49. I've just assigned both an upvote and a downvote to that post, which is kind of useless. The way that Reddit does it is, say I had this post upvoted. So right now it's at 50. When I click the downvote button, what it should do is it should toggle the upvote button off, so it should go back down to 49, and then it should toggle the downvote button on, so then it should go down to 48. So basically, if it's already at 50 and I have upvote selected, clicking downvote should unselect this button, and it should go from 50 down to 48. Same deal with clicking upvote if you have downvote selected. If it's originally at 48 because I have downvote selected, clicking upvote should take it from 48 up to 50, and it should unselect the downvote button. So you should already see you'll probably need to have 2 booleans to keep track of if the upvote is clicked on right now and if the downvote is clicked on. And then you'll need to do a little if statement logic in order to figure out, okay, what is the value of upvotes and downvotes right now? And how do I deal with selecting and unselecting each of those buttons? I'm going to leave that mystery to you guys, but hopefully that makes enough sense about how these upvote and downvote buttons are actually going to work. And you'll see optionally you can change the CSS as well to give a visual indicator to the user that this one is selected or this one is selected by changing the color of that button. You can change the background color, you can change the icon color, whatever you want. And then this is the second task. This one's going to be, I wouldn't say more challenging, but it's going to require a deeper understanding of how state management works, where we're going to go ahead and keep track of user engagement on our entire page. So say that this page that we have pulled up inside of our Reddit app is r/bitsofgood, for example, if you're familiar with how Reddit works. And we want to keep track of all of the upvotes and all of the downvotes that are on the page right now. So we'll be able to see a running list, like adding up all of the posts and all of the upvotes on each of those posts. We don't have to worry about comments, because worrying about comments as well would get very hairy and very confusing. We're just going to worry about the upvotes and downvotes on posts, and we're going to add all of those up in order to see total user engagement. So if we had like 3,000 posts on here, and each of those posts has 10 upvotes, what we should be able to see at the top is in the user engagement ribbon that we're going to create, it should say total upvotes. We had 3,000 posts and 10 upvotes for each of them. So it should say upvotes 30,000. And then downvotes would be adding up all the downvotes for each of the posts. Again, not worrying about comments, which could be some other number. So heading back to the task description, what you'll need to do is you'll need to add some HTML for this task. You don't have to worry about how you label everything or how you style everything. Just make sure it's clear and easy to read. And then you need to figure out a way to keep track of all of the upvotes and downvotes within the app.js component. So that's going to require lifting state in some way. So app.js needs to keep track of all of the upvotes and downvotes on the page. So each individual post component is going to have to tell app.js, hey, I just got upvoted, so you need to increase that user engagement. Or I just got downvoted. You need to increase the downvotes on that user engagement counter. You'll notice that there's a little bit of weirdness there of, am I keeping track of every time you click an upvote button? Or do I have to add up all of the existing upvotes and then keep track of the upvote buttons? You could go either direction with this. For the base implementation, what I would recommend doing is, first of all, having part 1 completed before moving on to part 2. And every time an upvote button is clicked, tell app.js, hey, I just got an upvote button clicked on this post, and I need you to increase the amount of upvotes by 1. Similarly, if a downvote button is ever clicked, tell app.js, I need you to increase downvotes by 1. And if you're brave enough and you want to add up all of the initial upvotes and downvotes so that they both don't start at 0. So it's not like upvotes 0, downvotes 0, and then I click on a button and then it goes to upvotes 1. If you want to start the upvote and downvote values to what they should be, in this case, on the React app page, we would have total upvotes 50 and total downvotes 1, because we have 1 post on the page total. That post is 50 upvotes and 1 downvote. So the total upvote should say 50, total downvote should say 1. If you want to do that instead of starting them both at 0, you can totally do that. It'll just require a little bit of extra logic in order to figure out what are the initial values of each post and how do I add them up. But if you just want to set it up, not worrying about the initial values, just increasing and decreasing whenever you click on buttons, go ahead and do that instead. So that should be a hopefully clear explanation of how both of these issues should be resolved. In order to work on this issue, you need to set up your own branch on GitHub so that when you're working on this, you'll actually be able to publish your code as a pull request for me to check out the code that you wrote so that I can see whether or not it is good enough to merge into the final code base. So the way you set up a branch is very simple. Just move your cursor down to the bottom left of your Visual Studio Code editor. Click on this, you'll see we're in the master branch right now. And we need to go ahead and create a new branch. In this case, just make it your name. That's what I would recommend. And then a slash and the name of the issue that you're resolving. This is generally good practice so that all of your branch names are descriptive. In this case, we're updating the UI to keep track of updates and downvotes. So I would just call this maybe a vote logic so that when I'm going to look at branches, I know, okay, this branch was created by me and I was working on setting up the vote logic for this specific branch. So go ahead and create that. When I hit enter, I should see on the bottom left, my branch should change from master to the name of the branch I just created. And then from here, you can safely work on your own code and you don't have to worry that it's going to get lost at any point. And as you're working, go ahead and try to commit and push your code. Again, go ahead and look at the getting started guide to figure out how to commit and push. But by the end of it, you should be able to create a pull request to this code base. And if you're following along online, you will not be able to create a pull request because you don't have permission to do so. But if you're following along in person and you sent me your GitHub username so I could add you to the code base, you should be able to create a pull request just fine. And just a little walkthrough on how to do that. We can go ahead and head back here and head over to the pull request page and create a new pull request. And all you need to do is find the name of your branch that you should have published at this point and create pull requests from there. And in order to publish your branch, make sure that well, if we head over to our Git tab, we'll be able to just push this branch up, and it'll automatically prompt us to publish this branch to GitHub. So we'll go ahead and do that. It'll push up our branch, which currently doesn't have anything in it, so that when we go to our pull request, we'll actually be able to see our particular branch name if we search for it here. In this case, I can find my Ben Vote Logic branch, and we'll see that I haven't changed anything yet, but once I start changing stuff and I push up the code that I changed, we should see all of that reflected inside of here. All right, so if you're front end, you can stop watching the video here, get to working. If you're back end, welcome. You should have been able to click on the timestamp that I had listed in the description in order to get here. And we're going to go ahead and walk through the back end. in order to understand how all of that is working. So I'm going to head over to our backend code base. If you're working on backend and you don't want to worry about the front end issue at all, which is what I would recommend doing, go ahead and close this front end directory. You don't have to touch it at any point. You'll just need to run the front end in order to make sure your backend is working correctly. You can also use Postman in order to debug as you're working. So I'm going to open the backend directory here. And you'll notice that the setup of this backend is a little bit more complex than the backends that we've been working with so far. So we'll just start with app.js, since that should be the most familiar territory for you. I'll go ahead and close out of all of these front-end files as well. Inside of here, we see a lot of dependencies that need to be installed in order to get this working. Mongoose should be the one that you're familiar with. That's the only one that we really need to worry about. That is our key in order to connect to the MongoDB database that we have set up. We'll see that we connect using the string that we have defined in our environment file. And then a couple other things in order to confirm that we connected to MongoDB successfully when we run our application. This stuff you don't have to worry about too much. It basically allows you to document your API. If you want to look around the internet to understand what Swagger actually does in order to document everything, you totally can, although it's certainly not required. And the main thing that we have to worry about here is it's going to create a /API. So if we go to localhost 3001 /API, we'll be able to access all of our API endpoints. And all of those are defined inside of routes. And we can go ahead and see where routes is defined. In this case, it's importing from the routes directory in order to get everything working. We just have an index file inside of here. And you'll notice already this is looking a little bit different from the stuff that we were doing before. So functionally, it's almost exactly the same. So we set up a route. In this case, our application only has one route total, and that's just going to be the base route because we don't have like a route for users and a route for getting posts and a route for getting comments. We're just getting it all off of the base API. So in this case, we could say we set up a router even though we only have one route. It's kind of useless. There's not a huge reason to have a routes folder, but it's just good practice. So as your API scales and you want to add a few other routes, like if we want to add user authentication, we would probably want to add a users route in order to handle all of the API endpoints just dealing with users. But in this case, we're only dealing with Reddit posts. We're not dealing with anything else in our database, so it's safe to just have a single route. So the sort of confusing part here is the word controller. And this is stemming from a common architecture that you'll see when you're setting up APIs, which is model, view, and controller. In this case, our models are going to be all of our database models. Our view is just going to be the front end, so we don't have to worry about the view for this application. But controller is basically a way to push out all of the logic that we have set up into separate functions that we're able to call on each of our API endpoints. So let's take /post as an example. So traditionally, the way that you would set this up, just using all of the logic that we've learned up to this point, you would probably set up a get endpoint. You would specify the path, which would be /post, and then you would set up your traditional function in order to handle that request and do something with it. The request body, the result that we're going to send back to the client, and any errors if we want to log a particular error. You should be very familiar with the syntax at this point, getting the request query, and then getting all the parameters off of that query, sending a response, and all of that good stuff. We're very familiar with that. But in certain cases, we may want to have the same function assigned to multiple routes. For example, if we wanted to run the same function, whether we were posting or getting from the /post path, what we would want to do is, if we're doing a very rudimentary example, we would copy and paste the logic from one function over to the other. So in this case, if I wanted the same thing to happen, whether I was getting from post or I was posting to post, I would have to copy and paste the function body for each of these. Alternatively, we could set up an external function and pass that in as a prop to this guy. So for example, maybe I have a function called post logic. And we expect this function to take in a request and be able to send a response or any errors. And what we want it to do is send a response of 200. Or I believe we would actually have to do send status in order to send the status code of 200. So what we would do inside of here, if we want the same thing to happen for get posts and post posts, kind of hard to say, we would go ahead and pass in our post logic function. Notice that this is functionally equivalent to what we had before. All we're doing is we're taking the arrow function that we had defined inside of here, and we're pushing it out to a variable. So now when we pass in post logic, it will do the same thing whether we are getting or posting from that endpoint. This is very nice for just reusability of logic, maybe having some if statements depending on whether it's a get or a post request. And that is the reason that we actually use controllers. Because what controllers allow us to do is define a set of functions that are a certain set of logic. And then we're able to import those functions into the specific API endpoints where we want to use them. In this case, we have our post function, in this case, the index function inside of our post file. And that index function is going to take in a request, send a response, and do any of the logic necessary to handle any request that's sent to posts. And in order to see how this function is actually working, we can see that this is actually imported from a file, or in this case, a directory of files called /controllers. And we can see that controllers directory defined here. And in order to go into that function, what we can do is either go to the controllers directory directly and go to the index file, or actually go to the post file, because that's what we're trying to get here. We can go to the post.js and find the index function. In this case, the index function takes in a request, sends a response, and what it's able to do is it's able to take in some data, it's able to send a response, and then it's using this next functionality. This is kind of an older way of using Express, so don't worry about that too much. Just type exactly how you would before using req, res, and error. But that's all it's doing. It's basically taking the function that we would define in line in here. You know, originally we would do something like this, where we define the entire function inside of the get endpoint. But in this case, instead of doing all of that and defining it in line, we're exporting that to another file. So that way we're able to reuse this function on any endpoint that has to have this particular functionality. So again, in order to go through all of that, we can see here we're accessing this function off of the controllers directory, which we're importing, and then the post file inside of that controllers directory, which is this guy right here, and then the index function inside of the post file. And in this case, the index function is an export from post.js. So a cleaner way to access this is you can actually hold down the command key on Mac or the control key on Windows, and you'll see a little hyperlink pop up. And when we click on that, it'll just jump to the post file and jump your cursor to that particular function. So we don't have to go hunting through a bunch of folders in order to figure out where this function gets defined. All we have to do, and I'll use a different example to really show you the magic here. If we're looking for the store function inside of the post file, we can just hold down command or control, wait for the hyperlink to show up, and click on it. And it'll jump our cursor right to that particular function. So it's super easy to just jump from your router into our set of controller functions. So you don't have to worry about navigating around, going through, scrolling, and trying to find the correct function. So heading back to our router, we can see all of those functions getting used on particular API endpoints. So that's the general flow that we're working with. We're just breaking out all of the functions into a separate file in a controllers directory. I know it, again, sounds a little verbose, a little bit silly, but as your database scales and as your API endpoints scale, it's really nice to export your functions to another file so that when you have multiple endpoints that all need to do the same thing, it's super easy for them to just go reference the same function so that they all perform the same functionality without having to copy and paste code a bunch of times. So what you're going to do is you're actually going to modify this set of endpoints and create a new function inside of here in order to deal with being able to get and filter post by particular dates and date ranges, as we had mentioned when we were walking through the initial project. So in order to get the full details on how to actually set up that endpoint, we're going to head back over to GitHub, and we're going to click on the Issues tab inside of Bootcamp Reddit project. Go grab that link in the Notion if you already closed out of this tab. And we'll see that there are two issues here. One of them is a front-end specific issue where we're setting up the upvote and downvote logic. Since you're in the backend track, you do not need to worry about this issue. But for the backend track, what we're going to do is we're going to set up the post endpoint to accept a date range filter. And this allows our front end to actually specify inside of this dropdown, hey, I only want to view posts from the last week or the last month, or I only want to view posts that were posted a year ago, and so on. And the front end is already set up to do this. The fetch request is already there. It's able to talk to your database. The only problem right now is it's making a fetch request and the backend has no idea what to do with it. So what we need to do is actually set up the API endpoints that when the front end tells us, I want the post from the past week, our backend is able to process that request, get the appropriate posts from the database, and then send those back to the front end. So we're going to head back over here and view all of the stuff that we need to understand and get done in order for this to run properly. So first of all, you're going to see some tools that you'll need to research in order to get this working. The first thing I would recommend looking up is how the heck date objects are supposed to work inside of JavaScript. I recommend going to the MDN documentation for this. we can see I'm already linking to the date page inside of MDN to make your lives a little easier. You can also just search MDN on Google and then search for any specific JavaScript term that you're trying to look up, and you'll get some really nice documentation for it. But this is like the full list of functions that the date object has on it. And you'll also need to look up how MongoDB is able to handle filter and date ranges. For this, I would recommend just Googling Mongoose specifically, or MongoDB. You can Google either one. Mongoose is the library we're using inside of JavaScript. MongoDB is the actual database that we're using. In this case, we're using Mongoose in order to query the database. So I'd recommend looking up how to do this with Mongoose specifically to make your life a little easier. Then just Google Mongoose date ranges. And just scroll through the results there, try to find something that could sort of help you out. This is something you'll typically do when you're an actual developer working in the field. You may have all the fundamentals down, but there's always little areas of the internet that you'll need to check out in order to understand how to set up particular API endpoints. So what we need to do for this specific task, first, I recommend setting up an endpoint where you're actually able to post data to the database so that we can manually define particular dates, so that when we're testing our date filter, we have like a post that was posted 10 years ago. We have a post that was posted 9 years ago. We have a post that was posted yesterday, and so on, so that when we change the date range filter, we're actually able to see whether or not we're displaying the correct post. You can either use the GUI for this. If you're working in the backend track, you should have heard of the Compass GUI. This basically lets you create and remove particular entries from your database. So you'll just be able to manually go in and create all of the dummy data you need in order to test your component. Or if you want a little bit of practice using the model view controller setup inside of our Express server, I'd recommend creating an endpoint in order to create your dummy data. So that way you can call that endpoint and say, hey, random API endpoint, create a post that has a date of August 15th, 1975, and a title of whatever and a text entry of whatever. So what you would want to do in here, if you want to create an endpoint to create dummy data, is you would want to accept a particular date string as a query param, and then create a date object based on that date string. And again, go check the MDN docs to understand how the heck the date object works, so it's able to take in this string and plop out a date that you're able to work with. And then you can hard code the title and text. Alternatively, you could accept the title and text as query parameters as well. But if you're creating an API endpoint for this, all you really need to worry about is defining the date parameter, so that when you're testing your filter, you can make sure that particular posts are popping up depending on the date range. And what you need to go ahead and do is set up a new post inside of that endpoint. So once it retrieves the date, go ahead and create a new post and make sure that post has the title and text that you have defined, the author field, which you can hard code as well, and then the created at field. And make sure this created at field is actually equal to the particular date that we have defined. So basically what we need to do in order for our database to understand what the heck our date object is, what we want to do is first accept the date as a query parameter to our endpoint, and then turn that into a date object so that we can use all the fancy date functions that JavaScript allow us to do. And then we want to take that date object and convert it to an ISO string. This is a very special way in order to store a date as a particular time zone agnostic string that's actually able to store the month, the year, the minute, the hour, all of the information about that particular date. And then MongoDB is able to accept that big string representing a date and store it as the created at field. And all we got to do once we create that new post is save that post to the database, as we have already learned to do using Mongoose. This is just the same setup that you've already been doing in order to create a model and then save that model to a database. And then refresh, make sure when you call that endpoint, it actually creates a post inside of the database. You can use the Compass tool in order to see whether that database entry actually gets inserted into the database. So once you have all of that completed, this task number 2, is the meat of what you're going to be doing. So what you need to do first is you need to create a new route in order to, actually no, you do not need to create a new route for this. What you'll be doing is you'll be modifying the logic at a particular route in order to accept a new query parameter. So in this case, we're going to be working with the post endpoint, which we have defined inside of our routes field here. We have the post endpoint, which we already looked at, and we're going to want to modify our index function. So heading over to index with our command click or control click, we're able to see right now all it's doing is it's not accepting any query parameters. It's just going to the database, grabbing all of the posts and all of the comments for each post using the populate function. And then once it does all that, it just takes all of the posts and returns them to the user. With a status code of 200, it's just sending back post as data. We'll see here that we're actually passing back post in the middle of some curly brackets. As a refresher, this is the equivalent of saying, I'm going to create an object, and that object is going to have a key of post, and the value of that key is going to be our post variable. But we'll see that the name of the value and the name of the key are identical. So as a shorthand, all we have to do is just say object post, and it's able to create an object with a key of post and a value of this post variable. So in summation, all it's doing is it's looking up all of the posts and all of the comments for those posts and sending them all back to the user, regardless of what date they were ever posted. So all we want to modify here is we want to leave this logic largely the same, except beforehand, what we want to do is check on the query parameters that were sent in the request body, and we're going to check for a particular field. In this case, we're going to be looking for 2 query parameters. The first one is going to be the date range, which is just going to be a hard-coded string, and you'll need to handle each of these on the backend with a series of if statements. It's going to send the date range query parameter with the past week, the past month, past year, or a year ago, or ancient times, which means 10 years old or older. And again, you'll need to have a series of if statements in order to say, okay, so the date range has a value of past week. That means I need to look up all of the posts that are posted in a range between today and 7 days ago. And then we have our current date, which is just going to be representing the current date on the user's end. There's a reason that we are passing this from the client as a query parameter, and that's because if we were to get the date on the server, which we have to do, remember, because if we were to get the post from the past week, we need to know what time and date it is right now, so that when we go and filter, we can take what time and date it is right now and then subtract 7 days from it in order to figure out, okay, if today is March 23rd, I want to get all the posts that have a date between March 23rd and March 16th. So in order to do that, we have to understand what date is it right now so that my range is correctly scoped. And if we were to just use new date in order to get what date and time it is on the server right now, this could potentially be incorrect. And that's because if you remember how servers are distributed, looking way back to when we were talking about server-client architecture, the server is existing on some box way off in cyberspace. And that box could be in it could be in Venezuela, it could be off on the West Coast, it could be on the East Coast of America. It all depends. So because of that, the time zone of where our server is deployed could be different depending on where that box is currently living. So in order to make sure when the user clicks on a dropdown and says, I want to post from the past week, we can make sure that we are using their date and time, we're using their time zone, so that when we're sending a response back from the database, it is based on the client's date and time. It's not based on whatever date and time it is on where our server is running. So that's why we need to accept the current date as a query parameter from the client that's making the request, rather than just doing it server-side. So that's what we're doing. We're getting an ISO string, which we saw in part 1. We're just using that to convert to a date object. Again, you can go look up MDN to understand what an ISO string is. And then we're accepting the date range, which is just a string that we are supposed to interpret and understand on our backend. So all we have to do is check whether those 2 parameters exist. If they don't, just fall back to this logic. So basically, if the client didn't send a date range and it didn't send a current date, just go ahead and do this as we were already doing to send back all of the posts, because we're not trying to filter by anything yet. But if they do specify a date range and a current date, then we need to go into our set of if statements to say, okay, well, if rec query date range is equal to past week, for example, then we need to go ahead and figure out, okay, I want to go to our MongoDB database, and I want to get all of the entries that were created at, using the created at field, remember. I want to get all the fields that were created at either today, a day ago, 2 days ago, all the way down to the past week. And then I want to return that list of posts that were just created during the past week to the user. So a lot of it's just going to be copying and pasting the same logic here. If you want to modularize this and have some external functions, be my guest. And we're going to go ahead and add a couple extra fields here in order to filter by anything that was created either a day ago, 2 days ago, and so on. So again, go look up on the internet how to do that with Mongoose so that you sort of understand the syntax and figuring out the logic to correctly interpret all of these query params in order to send back the correct list of posts to the user. And once everything is completed, you'll actually be able to go over to the front end. Remember, spin that up using npm start inside of the front end directory. And when you click on this dropdown and change the value of it, you should see the list of post update on the front end, depending on whatever your backend is sending back. So that's a great way to debug it when you're done and you feel like everything is working. But if you don't want to use the UI in order to debug the entire time you're working, I'd recommend either using Postman or curl in your command line if you're a command line warrior in order to test your endpoint while you're working. And remember, you'll probably need to restart your database every time in order to reflect the changes that you make. So that's everything. You should have enough information from this in order to get working on it. And remember, when you're working, you should be working off of a new branch rather than the master branch. And here's how you do that. I explained this to the front end. I'll explain it to you all as well. I have a branch set up right now. I'll just go back to what you guys should see, which is you should currently be on the master branch if you just cloned this repository. So what we want to do is at the bottom left here, click on our current branch, and then click Create New Branch in order to create a new branch where you'll be able to work on all of the code that's resolving this particular issue. So what we want to name our branch is usually our name, so we can easily go and reference this branch later on, and then a little description of what the heck this branch is trying to resolve. In this case, we're creating a branch in order to resolve this particular issue. And this issue says we're going to update the post endpoint to accept a date range filter. So maybe we want to say post endpoint date range. And that's our little description on our branch to sort of say, okay, the issue that I'm working on is to add a date range filter to the post endpoint. And here's my name so that I can easily reference it later. So I'll go ahead and enter. And we should see at the bottom left, our current branch should change from master to the name of the branch that we created. And when we're ready to publish this, we'll be able to go to our set of GitHub tools, and we'll see a few changes were made already, just with the stuff that I was typing here. We'll be able to go ahead and push up this branch by clicking the three dots, hit push, and it'll notice, hey, this branch is not published for other people to access it. Would you like to publish your branch? You'll be able to hit OK on that one. See a little loading spinner here. And once that's completed, we'll be able to head over to our GitHub here, go to pull request, and then create a new pull request with the name of the branch that we created. In this case, I can search for my name, and I can see all the branches that I created. This is one I created for the front-end task. Here's the one we created for the back-end task. I'll hit enter on that, and we'll see currently we haven't changed any files yet. We have not committed any particular changes, but once you're completed with the project, you'll be able to go in here, click on the name of your branch, and you'll see a list of all of the changes that you made to, in this case, the post.js file. And once you feel like, okay, all my work is perfect, I'm ready to submit it, I feel like this is good enough to go into the master code base, or base master, go ahead and make a pull request using the buttons I just showed you. Look at all the changes here to make sure it all looks good, and then describe all of the changes that you made on your particular issue. And then just go ahead and submit that pull request so I can review it and give you feedback. All right, so now you should have all of the skills in order to get going. If you have any questions, shout me out on Slack, of course, and also attend the office hours so that you can get help while you're working. And if you're following along online, you will not be able to make a pull request because you don't have permission to access this repository. But you'll at least be able to create a new branch on your own machine and sort of get everything working locally. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out at hello@bitsofgood.org. Just email us, ask any questions that you have, maybe send a screenshot of the app running if you're really proud of it, just to show that you're able to understand the issue and get it running successfully. It's really nice to see that because we're experimenting with the online version of this course right now, so it's good to get feedback from you all as well. So thank you for watching this video. Hopefully that was informative, so best of luck.